introduce our visitor for today. This is Dr. Thomas Dolan from the University of Central Florida. We're happy to have him here, and I won't waste a lot of his time with a long introduction, so here you go.
Thank you. As he said, my name's Tom. No one calls me Thomas, not even my parents. They call me by my middle name. Slideshow. Today, and I believe from your syllabus, for the next few weeks, you're going to be talking about war. Why do we study war? We study war because it's one of the dominant things at certain points in time in international relations. We study war because it can affect not only the way states interact with each other, but the way that societies develop. And we study war because war is a terrible thing, and if at all possible, we'd like to avoid it. But what is it? If we want to study and understand war, first we have to know what it is. Now, the word war and the language of war is used in lots of different ways to refer to lots of different things. So our first step needs to be to come up with a good definition of war. And that is, we need to ask the question, what are the things that have to be going on in order to make a thing war, right? Now, to sort of set the stage for that, what are some things that we talk about like they're war or sometimes call war? What are some examples of things that you may have called war? What are some actual wars? What are some things where we talk about like they're war?
World War II.
World War II, great.
The war on drugs.
The war on drugs, right. Which may or may not be a war, depending on how we define it. What else?
Cyber warfare.
Cyber warfare, which is, at least as it's been practiced so far, much more like vandalism than what we really think about as war. The war on terror.
The card game war.
The card game war, yes. Football. Has anyone ever heard football talked about as if it's war? People, teams like, going to war, or, I'm going at grave risk of showing myself to be old. I think there's some sportswear companies that say, protect this house, as if, there's going to be actual fighting going on here, and even a house involved. So, we need to first, yes?
I would say the Cold War.
The Cold War, yes. Ideological wars. So we first need to say, how can we define war in such a way that we can actually put things that are like each other together and exclude things that are not what we really think of as war from that category? And it's really important because this kind of precision in language and conceptual clarity makes it much easier to understand the thing that we're going to be ultimately studying and learning about. So let's talk about some of the things that we think need to be present to have a war, at least in the way that we talk about it in terms of political science. And the first thing, I think almost every scholar would agree with this, is fighting. Usually when we think about war, that's probably the first thing that we think about. But what do we mean when we talk about fighting? Well, if you've read the slide, you would say mutual violence. Which leads us to a question. What's violence? And this is an actual question, not a rhetorical question. What's violence?
Is it where someone suffers at the hand of someone else?
Okay. So what causes someone to suffer?
Like physical pain.
Okay.
Right? If I punch someone in the face. Financially, right? If I cut out my business partner, he loses everything. That could be one form of violence.
It's an interesting idea. So, what's your name?
Max.
Max has suggested that causing someone else to suffer is violence. What do we think about that idea? He gave a couple of ideas. He says you could punch someone in the face, or he could punch someone in the face, and they would suffer. But then he also said maybe if we could do like financial violence. We could cut someone out of a deal. What do we think about that?
I think it goes back to what you have on the slide about what your motive is, or why did you cut it out of the business, or why did you punch it in the face?
Okay.
What's your intention behind doing it?
Okay.
I think that scope of violence is a little too broad because if that's the definition of violence, then we're violent pretty much every day
Okay.
without knowing. So we can cause harm in so many different ways that it's impossible to
Okay.
narrowly define it out.
Okay.
Something I like is the World Health Organization. That's a definition for it.
Do they?
Yeah, it says the intentional use of physical force of power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another results in, or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or degradation.
With all due respect to the World Health Organization, you can tell that that definition was made by a committee and that everyone wanted their view of violence included into that.
I like the word intentional in there.
Okay. Okay. Intention? Yes?
I think a good word to describe it is enmity.
Enmity. Okay. A lot of what we've had so far has been thinking in terms of the effect of what we think of as violence or the intention behind it, right? I think that that's important. I think something that also has been present, and maybe the most fundamental element here, is harm. So there has to be some kind of harm in order for something to be violence. But then we have the question, is any doing of harm, or any intentional doing, is every intentional doing of harm violence? Can we think of any kinds of intentional inflictions of harm that might not be violent? Excuse me, that might not be violence.
What I could think of, like when you're a child, saying a snarky comment to a parent or saying something mean to a friend,
Okay.
might not necessarily be categorized as violence.
Okay.
I think there's like in my
Sort of the
mind-
sticks and stones rule?
Yeah, exactly. In my mind, there's a certain threshold you need to cross in
Okay.
order for something to be categorized as violence.
Okay.
Well, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that you can harm someone economically and that can be considered violence.
Yeah.
Sanctions, an act of violence, an act of war.
It's an interesting question, and different people differ. If you look at some of the philosophical work on the nature of violence, some people are less accepting of including kinds of non-physical harm as violence, and so there's sort of some differences of opinion here, right? Let me ask you about something specific. Is boxing violence? What about wrestling, like high school wrestling? I see some people shaking their heads. Why not?
Well, in like high school wrestling, you're not actually trying to like hurt them, you're just trying to pin them. So it's not really intentional harm.
Well, I feel like it's more of the intentions, because like in wrestling, you're not trying to take out the person, like make sure they get away from that. Your intention is to complete a set of goals. Not even with boxing, like I would consider boxing not as violent. Maybe, I don't know.
So it might be violent, but is it violence?
Yeah, I don't think it's violence because
Okay.
it's that their goals aren't to end the other person, like to just wipe them off the face of the earth or anything.
I mean, it is to knock them out.
Yeah, it's not. I feel like it's not like they're doing it because they have hatred towards the person or anything.
Okay.
I feel like you can't say that it's not because they're literally called combat sports.
Is combat always violence?
Yeah, well, I mean, the notion there is it's not obviously combat. Like when you're wrestling someone, you're not like going to war with that person. But
Yes.
it's used that way exclusively because of the violent nature of sport.
Okay. A lot of you have talked about in terms of intentions of the person doing it. But what about what the other person's role in this? What makes boxing different from violence in terms of what the other person says?
I guess I would say it's because like in boxing, the other person, or like wrestling, like you're both there, you have the same goal. It's not, if you see some random guy in the street, you want to start beating him up, that would be violence.
There's this basic element of consent with sports, right? We think of sports as being different from violence because both sides are consenting to a certain range of actions which they know could happen. They know that they could be harmed, but by getting into the ring, they're saying, I'm okay with this. When we think about violence, there's this non-consensual element to it. So one way of thinking about what violence is, with perhaps a few less words than the WHO, is to think of it as non-consensual harming, right? So when we talk about war, we're talking about at least two groups of people that are trying to harm each other against the other's will. And that's actually important that it be mutual violence. Because if you only have one side trying to harm the other, that's not really what we think of as fighting, right? That might be bullying, that might be, in the context of international relations, genocide. It might be a lot of things. But it's not war. War is defined by fighting. Fighting is defined by two sides engaging in efforts to harm the other. Next point. I say that it's between organizations, states or state-like groups. Imagine you've defined what a state is, so I'm not talking about Utah or Florida here, although Florida would probably win. Why can't individuals participate in a war in a meaningful sense?
Because I feel like in a war, there are multiple avenues that are taken to achieve your ends, and if you're one person, there's only so much one person can do at a time.
There's only so much you can do, and there's also a fundamental vulnerability of an individual. Individuals go to sleep. I mean, I know that you probably try at least sometimes to not go to sleep so you can do your papers or whatever, but eventually you're going to go to sleep, right? States, state-like organizations, they don't go to sleep. And so even in that very basic sense, they're fundamentally stronger kinds of things than individuals. States or state-like groups have a political character to them that individuals don't. At least most individuals. I mean, some people may have arguments among the people in their head, but most don't. And so there's this fundamentally political character of the actors involved. And the last element of what makes something war has to do with motive. And this motive is going to separate war from things like crime. In order to think about and understand this motive, we're going to talk about Clausewitz. But before we talk too much about what he says, let's talk a little bit about who Clausewitz was. Has anyone ever encountered Clausewitz before? Yeah? Well, yes, last night with the reading. Excellent. That's very good. I meant before you got the reading. Right. So Clausewitz is a sort of a fascinating character. He was first and foremost a soldier, and he was a soldier almost all of his life. The book was written in the 1820s. He started being a soldier in 1793 at the age of 13 as the most junior kind of officer you could be in the Prussian army. And he spent the next 22 years of his life fighting Napoleon, not single-handedly, but first as a member of the Prussian military, and for a little time a member of the Russian military once the Prussians had kind of given up and taken a time out. Now, the book you read is sort of probably the culmination of his ideas about war, but it's also a little bit of a mystery because his wife published it. We have a picture of his wife, Countess Maria von Brühl. Now, their relationship itself is interesting, in part because they kind of explicitly saw each other as equal partners, in part because she was of considerably higher rank than him, and her parents did not want him to marry her, and so they had to wait like 7 years. Now, I know it might be shocking to you that your parents might not want you to marry someone else because they think you're too young or something, but this happened with them, and they still did it. And they were sort of seen as one of these like brilliant couples in the society of the time. So what happens is, after the Napoleonic Wars, Clausewitz decides to try and figure out what really happened here, and so he writes on war. And it's a little bit of a hard read and a little bit of an inconsistent read, because we know from his notes that at some point he had some kind of an epiphany, several hundred pages into the book, and he started rewriting the book from the beginning. And the question is where did it happen? And we don't know, because he got cholera and died, and his wife took all the papers and took them to the publisher, and that's why we have the book. But most people think that the first chapter, the section you read, reflects his mature ideas about war. And so if you ever read the rest of the book, what you'll find is that the first part of the book is an effort to grapple with the actual nature of war, and the rest of the book is a manual for fighting a war in the early 19th century. And very good if you ever want to do that. He said some things, and sometimes they almost get treated about aphorisms, about what war is and what the purpose of war is. And some of these get a little bit taken out of context, and so it might seem like he's defining things, but he's maybe not yet done so, because you may have noticed that the way he writes is he'll lay out this extreme position, and then he'll explain why it's wrong. So he's not the easiest read in that sense. I'm told it's even harder in the German, that the translators did us all a favor. But one of the first things he says is that war is an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. And that's a really powerful and useful statement, but there's also something that we need to recognize about it. It's powerful and useful is because it's telling us what the purpose of the violence is. And that the purpose of that violence is, and that violence does have a clear purpose, and that purpose is to essentially get something out of it. Now, the problem with this as a definition of war, which is what it's sometimes used as, is that this is actually describing what you do when you're going to war, rather than addressing the fundamental thing itself. Later in the book, one of the really interesting things that Clausewitz says is that wars only start when the defense begins to defend. Until that point, you just have one side engaging in violence, but we don't have fighting yet, right? So if you think about this, this is only a part of it, although it's a really important part of it. The other thing that I have up here reflects one of the most famous quotations from Clausewitz, which is that war is politics by other means. This is a more accurate description of what he says. It's also a bit longer, as you can tell. He says, war is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means. In order to understand what he's saying here, we need to know another definition. We need to know what it means to be political. Now you all, well, this is a political science course. I'm sorry if I'm going to do something that shows, what's politics? What does it mean to say that something is political?
So a basic definition is something dealing with the workings of the state.
Okay. There's a good bit there. Can you have politics, though, without the state? Have you ever been in a club?
Yeah.
Are there politics in the club?
Yeah.
Okay. But it has to do with groups at the very least, right?
Yeah.
I would say it has to do with the interaction of humans with each other as we try to form groups and units.
Okay.
As we try to work together to create cohesive units.
Okay. That's what's going on in politics, right? Yes.
I'd say sort of the interaction within a group, but also their interaction with other groups.
Okay.
How it all comes together to create an end.
Okay. Back in the 1950s, there was a guy named, I believe, Dolan, who said that politics is about who gets what, when, and how. In an essential sense, then, politics is about distribution. It's about getting things or avoiding losing things to others. And so when Clausewitz says that war is a political instrument, what he's saying here is not that it's something that you should use, but rather that the purpose of war, when war is being fought, is to get something or to avoid losing something. And arguably, we can see that in a lot of different contexts. In fact, there's even a book that was written probably about 20 years ago by a very distinguished military historian, an excellent military historian named John Keegan, who totally gets this wrong. He says, oh, war is a cultural thing. Clausewitz is totally wrong. But as you read it, it's clear that he doesn't understand what Clausewitz means by political. And so the examples that he gives actually show that Clausewitz is right, even as he's trying to show that he's wrong. Because in all the cases where he's trying to show that cultural practices affect the way that wars are being fought, he's actually showing that the reason for the war was to avoid losing things or to get stuff. Therefore, when we think about what war is, and this is sort of my definition, war is two or more organizations using violence against each other to try to alter the outcome of a political interaction. War doesn't come out of nowhere. Rather, it's something that states or groups resort to when they can't get what they want by other means. That is, it has a fundamentally prospective character to it. The leaders of states or states are essentially saying, I want to be better off, or I don't want to lose this. And the only way to avoid losing this, or the only way to get this thing, is to actually go and fight a war. Quick example, the Winter War. Familiar to everyone, I'm sure, right? Has anyone heard of the Winter War? It's okay. The Winter War was fought, but you have. What can you tell us about it?
War between Russia and Finland.
Yes, it was. That's exactly right. The Soviet Union and Finland fought a war between November 30th, 1939 and the 13th of March, 1940. the reason that they fought a war is that the Soviets felt that the Germans were going to attack them before too long, and so they wanted to have better defenses for Leningrad, and because of the way the Russian Revolution had ended, Finland was about 70 kilometers from Leningrad, which was at that time within artillery range. So the Soviets said, we would like some more territory, please give it back to us. The Russians had owned Finland before, so they thought of this as sort of just getting it back. And the Finns said no, and the Finns were stubborn, so you might, I don't know. Anyways, yes, I will avoid making a cultural reference that I might regret. The Finns were stubborn and said no, in part because they were afraid that the Soviets would use this to take over their country. And so they reached an impasse, and the Soviets attacked. But ultimately here, the thing that, the reason that the Soviets attacked, and they'd said, we don't want to attack you, we just want this stuff. And the Finns said no, so they said, well, fine, have it your way. It didn't actually work out that well for the Soviets, though. With this in mind as our definition, what are some of the things that we may have mentioned before that don't fit? What are things that we might call war kind of in our, or talk about as war in our everyday speech or conversation that don't fit within this conceptual definition of war? Yes?
The war on Christmas or the war on women, as so commonly stated.
Okay.
Because they don't use violence.
Right, so, well, they don't use violence. They're not even necessarily against things. I mean, the war on Christmas would be a war on an idea, right? And is an idea an organization? No, it's not. Therefore, it's not what we're talking about here. Anything else? The Cold War, yes. The Cold War is remarkable for its peacefulness, right? Yes, there were proxy wars, but there were no wars between the United States and the Soviet Union or, the major European states. And so in a very meaningful sense, while perhaps unpleasant, the Cold War was not a war. What about the war on terror? A war?
Yes and no. I think if you keep it in the broad sense, it's not because you're fighting an ideal. But if you look at the way that it's actually played out, it's trying to eliminate specific organizations. And so I guess in a broad sense, no. But if you were to look at specific interactions within the war, it would fall under this definition.
I think it would at best be multiple wars that we sort of lump together, right? And so we can think reasonably about a war on the Taliban, potentially about a war on Al-Qaeda, right? But a war on terror doesn't make sense in these contexts. That's right. Now, while this is a useful definition for understanding what war is, it may not always be terribly useful if we want to make a list of wars, for instance. That is, if we want to say, okay, this political interaction between states that had some fighting was clearly a war, but what about this one? And so in international relations, we commonly have what's called the correlates of war definition. And this is what's used, I would say we use this to recognize a war in the wild, so that we are, again, only counting the things that are basically similar to each other. And the two requirements here is fighting between two states and at least 1,000 battle deaths. Now, the fighting between two states is used to define war between states. They have other definitions for non-state actors. But what about this 1,000 battle deaths? Why do you think they include that? Why would that matter?
I think there's it's saying that there's a certain threshold that needs to be reached. Up until that point, it's just like a proxy war or a skirmish or a disagreement. But once you've reached 1,000 battle deaths, it's formally defined as a war.
Right, and they think that if you reach 1,000 battle deaths, their intuition, which you're essentially getting at here, is that this is something that was probably ordered by the leaders of the country. It's an intentional action of large scale, right?
So what if two countries mutually declare war, but the casualties are less?
Then it would probably not be encountered by these guys and most international relations scholars as a war. There is one exception, which, I don't know if it proves the rule or if it shows that they're not as serious as they might be. And that's the Falklands War, which was between the Argentines and the British and only killed around 762 people, but they put it on the list anyways. Now, typically, what is important, though, is something you mentioned, this declaration of war. Something that scholars don't care, something that many international relations scholars who study war don't care about is the law. Most international relations scholars don't care that much for things like declarations of war or really international law at all, in the sense that they don't think it really affects what's going on, right? And to a certain extent, countries don't necessarily obey international law in that sense that much either. I mean, when was the last time the United States formally declared war? Does anyone know? A guess.
World War II.
Yes, December of 1941. Has the United States, from this social science perspective, been in wars since then? Yes, it has. They just choose to authorize them by things other than declarations of war. So now we have authorizations to use military force, which isn't a war, even though anyways. So that we don't have to deal with what countries say that they're doing, we see what they're actually doing. This also helps us to avoid the kind of skirmishes that sometimes accidentally happen. So I don't know how true this is now, but at one point I was told by someone who studies such things that the Indians and the Pakistanis typically exchange some artillery shells every other week or so. And very frequently this is because someone's drunk. Is that war? Probably not. Why not? If nothing else, because a couple of drunk guys does not make for a state decision to engage in war, right? And so this kind of threshold becomes really helpful and useful in dealing with that kind of problem. Now, the chapter of Clausewitz that you read doesn't just help us understand what war is, but it also tells us some things about the process of war. And the way that he does this is by talking about absolute war and real war. And what's important as we approach this discussion, it may not have been clear as you read it, is that Clausewitz doesn't think that absolute war really exists, but he talks about it as a way of kind of helping us understand the tendencies that war might go towards. So what does he mean? What does he talk about when he's talking about absolute war?
So in the book, he talked about how our actions are dictated by our political objective.
Yes.
And also limited by our political objective.
Right.
We don't take certain actions that would violate, like, I guess, ethical code. Under that sense, I'm just going to put a guess out here that absolute war would be the rejection or just loss of those moral holdings.
So, I'm not. So when this is kind of a definitional issue. When Clausewitz talks about moral, he's actually talking about psychological. It's kind of an archaic use of the term. So he's not necessarily talking so much about ethics, but he is talking about politics as having a limiting effect on real war, right? When he talks about absolute war, he's talking about war in this kind of idealized, as an idealized thing, where you are essentially bringing all the power of one state against all the power of another state in the same place at the same time. And he says, ultimately, that's what we might think of war as wanting to tend towards, because generally, if one side has more power than the other on the battlefield, the side with more power wins. But he says that's never possible. That's never possible, in part because politics limits the scope and scale of war. Leaders won't pay, they won't put their whole country's economy into a war, right? It's limited because of basic physics. You can't get all the, certainly in the 18th century, you can't bring all the resources of a country together at a single point and at a single time, right?
So would you say absolute war is like the game of Risk, where you just have your 10 guys, in Siberia, and you're attacking China?
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Absolute war, in a sense, is something that he says can actually exist. And we'll hold the thought, yes. It's important to recognize that when he's talking about absolute war, he's not talking about total war, which is a sort of 20th century phrase that describes the economics of war. But what he does tell us about real war is that real war is something that happens through he says it's a pulsation of violence. You have battles and then you have periods without battles. And he tells us that it's a fundamentally political process. It's not ruled by military things. It's not ruled by the interaction of violence, but rather by political leaders who are trying to get certain things through it. It's something that has what he calls fog and friction. So everything doesn't go perfectly in war. In fact, he has this wonderful line that in war everything is simple, but the simplest thing is very hard. Now, to help us think through what he's talking about when he's talking about real war, how is real war different from Risk? As I said, hold that thought. Has anyone ever played Risk? Oh, good. Can someone share the rules of Risk with us? Really quickly. I'm not asking for an hour-long disposition.
So basically, you each get your little countries and you put a guy on each of your little countries. And the objective is to take over the whole
Yes.
board. And so you, depending on how many armies and all the other stuff you have, you get to put a certain amount on the board each turn, and then you can choose to attack other countries by rolling the dice, and just try and get higher rolls than the other people so that you can get the board.
So battle is determined by a roll of the dice, right? Okay. Thank you. Very good. How is that different and similar to what Clausewitz is talking about?
I really like this. Me and my siblings play Risk every time I'm back home. It's like family tradition. So one of the things that Risk is very much like war for us, it's a gamble. It's just
Yes.
like a dice roll. I think every person who's played Risk has that one story where you're like, I had one guy in Iceland and I defeated 50 of my brother's armies, and he was furious. And Clausewitz mentions is that war is a gamble, and that that emotions are a part of war.
Right.
So those are two things that are very much a part of the game of Risk and are very much a part of real life. So.
Yes, very good. What else? What else is similar to or different from?
So there's a certain, you can understand your enemy to a certain extent, but there's also a little bit of ambiguity.
Okay.
You can't understand your enemy's troop movements. You can't fully know how large their military is. In Risk, you can. You can look at the board and say, I know my enemy has X amount of pieces on the board, but you don't know how many they'll have next turn. You can't always be 100% certain.
Okay, so there's maybe some elements, greater elements of certainty in Risk, but there's still chance, there's still probability, there's still uncertainty about the future. What else?
Clausewitz talks about the three different levels that we can analyze war, like people, the commanders, and then the government itself. And that doesn't come into play in Risk, where Risk is a lot more static. It's just dice rolls, and you're just putting numbers against numbers. But in war, there's a lot more going on, like morale, actual skills of your leaders, and then the government motives.
So the skills of the person playing Risk don't matter?
No. Dice matter.
The dice, well, yeah, but you know, I mean, as a certain country song might have suggested, you got to know when to roll them and know when not to. I think that it's true that you don't have, well, hopefully you don't have multiple levels going on in a Risk player, right? But you still do have some of these elements, both of skill and the kind of the psychological aspects of how you play, right? And that's true if we're thinking about generals in war.
In Risk, everything is done turn per turn. Each person has to take their turn, and Clausewitz explains that in war, it's kind of each player or actor is forced to do that as well, because not one of them can just withhold while the other attacks, or else they get the upper hand. So there's sort of this forced interplay of each person back and forth. However, I think that also shows a difference in that Risk has rules, whereas Clausewitz explains that in war there really are no rules. All rules are out the window because it's always going to be more important to achieve your goals than to follow any international law that there may be.
And of course, not everyone would agree with Clausewitz on that, right? But that's certainly, he's essentially describing war as a game in which you make your own rules.
I think one way that's different is that in Risk, your goal is the complete annihilation of the other person.
Yes.
In real life, you're not going to see a war, at least usually, a big major war for over the entire world where it ends with one person, like one leader, over all of it. It always ends up like being a treaty, where you guys come to an agreement that stops everything and all that. In Risk, you won't have like oh, well, you're beating the crap out of me, so let's just have a treaty and I'll let you have these lands and this land, and I'll just keep this part here. It's you're all in or you're going to die. So.
Right, and that's very good, because that gets at what he was saying before, that war is political, right? Is Risk political? Risk only becomes political if you add stakes to the game, right? If you say, okay, if you're playing with, say, your brother, it's like, okay, whoever loses mows the lawn, right? Okay, now that might be political, right? And now maybe you could have an agreement too, right? It's like, well, I feel like I'm losing, but so how about I mow the front yard and you mow the backyard, right? You could do that. You could turn Risk into a political thing, but on its own, just the board game, you're exactly right. You go for world domination and annihilation of everyone else. And we can think of a couple of exceptions, but that typically doesn't happen in the real world. Okay. Yes?
Clausewitz talks about the advantage of the defensive side.
Uh-huh.
There is the defensive team has the extra die, which proves to be very helpful in defending.
Mm-hmm.
Good advantage.
Yes. Very good.
This might be a room, but Clausewitz also talked about the social construct before war starts.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm playing with friends or best friends, I'm less likely to be as harsh on them, or if someone attacks them, like I'm going to be harsher on that.
Uh-huh.
So you can see those relationships even in the game of Risk.
Yes. Yep. Good. Yes. Last person.
One other thing Clausewitz talks about that kind of limits real war is the fact that it's part of the larger political interactions.
Right.
That's one thing Risk doesn't have. It's isolated. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that interaction, and so your decisions on whether or not to attack or to defend are not based on what might happen after the war.
Right.
That's not looking at it.
Right. That's exactly right. Again, unless you're factoring in the amount of time you're spending playing, it doesn't affect the rest of your life, right? Whereas what you put into war and what comes out of war certainly affects the lives of countries. Now, over the next while, you're going to be talking a bit about why countries go to war and when war happens. I'm going to give you a simple answer, which I'm sure your teacher will develop in all sorts of different ways. But the simplest reason that states go to war is that they think that they can win. Now, I put win in quotation marks not to scare you, but because winning can be defined in different ways. That war I mentioned before, the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, was Finland expecting to have a victory parade in Moscow? No, it was not. Finland was not expecting to conquer Moscow. Finland was hoping to survive as a mostly independent state. So for them, that was their goal. That was the thing that they were afraid that they couldn't get if they conceded to the Soviets. The Soviets, of course, wanted to take over Finland at that point. Both sides thought that they could win. Conceptually, we call this mutual optimism. That is, we only expect purposeful states, reasonably rational states, to go to war if they both think that they can win for some reason. Because otherwise, going to war doesn't make sense. Otherwise, if you're at all rational, it makes more sense to cut a deal. The costs of fighting are going to be big enough that they're going to make it possible, moreover, for both sides to cut a deal. So we should almost always expect countries to only go to war if they think that they can win. But if you think about that, that's actually kind of a puzzling statement in its way. It's puzzling because we have two countries, maybe lots of smart people on both sides, thinking they can win at the same time. And that means that they're disagreeing with each other. And so in order to have war, you have to have some kind of underlying disagreement. Now, the cause of that disagreement can vary. It could be that one side knows things that the other side doesn't know. It could be that there's a disagreement about, say, for instance, the size of their military. It could be that one side thinks it knows how to use technology better than the other side. We can think about this, the easy example of this is the beginning of World War II in tanks. The French thought that tanks were best used interspersed with infantry. The Germans thought that they were best used if you put them all together and sent them through the infantry. In 1935, this was a reasonable question about which you could argue. In 1941, it was not, right? But we can easily see how a wide variety of factors can lead to this disagreement and therefore make war reasonably possible. Thank you very much.